I am really glad to be here. I found out I was coming Tuesday morning. I am the fill-in for the fill-in. And so if you need to leave now, I understand. Scott McDowell works across the hall from me, and he's a great friend and mentor in a lot of ways, and he's said a lot of great things about this church. And when I talked to Jake Tuesday morning, I walked out of my office and I thought, okay, going to Chattanooga or going to Hixson this weekend, I don't know anything about that church. It was interesting. I walked down the hall and I saw my new friend who used to go to church here, Josh Oakley. Some of you may know he and his family, and he is not only working with us there at Lipscomb, but he and his family have been attending church with us, and so I've enjoyed getting to know him. And I told him I was coming, and he said, oh, this is a great place, great church, had nothing but great things to say, says to say hello. It's interesting, and I walk out my door, and there's Delaney Gilbert. And if you know Delaney, I think she probably was in this youth group at some point recently. She just graduated from Lipscomb and is working in the president's office with us, and told her, hey, I think I'm going to your church. And she thought that was a great idea. And then I turned around, and Walt Lever is walking up. Walt is the preacher at the Brentwood Hills Church of Christ. And he says, what are you talking about? And I said, I'm going to Chattanooga this weekend. He goes, tell my daughter Amy hello. I don't know Amy, but a hello from Walt. So all of a sudden, I felt like I knew a lot of things about this church. But it has been a blessing to be here this morning. I used to travel a lot when I worked for another Christian university in Texas, and oftentimes when I would travel, I would have a logo on my shirt, and I traveled pretty regularly on the same flights. And if you do that on a certain airline, oftentimes you'll find a lot of the same flight attendants. They have the same schedule too, and so as you're waiting for other people to board the plane, or as you have maybe a layover or whatnot, you get to visit with these folks. And so at one point, they were talking to me a lot about Christian education. They knew what I did and this and that. And anyway, we were on a flight one time across the country, and it was extremely turbulent. One of those trips that you never forget, right? One of those moments where you're thinking, okay, maybe this is it. And when you look around and you even see the flight attendants getting a little antsy, it makes you a little nervous, right? Anybody ever been there? Anyway, this was pretty bad. And so one of the flight attendants kind of steadies herself and comes up to me and says, Matt, the people are really nervous. We know you work for a Christian university. We need you to do something religious. I'm sitting there thinking, okay. So I stood up and I took a collection. Don't you love preacher stories? McDowell did tell me you would laugh. That's good. Have you looked around our world recently? I mean, not in such a negative, dire way, not in such a way that just makes you miserable, but with a sense of reality, have you looked around the world? Have you looked around our state, our cities, our communities? There's a lot of chaos. You could call it turbulence. There's a lot of need, there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of despair. We live in a world that's full of complexity, a world that's full of anxiety, a world that's full of opportunity, and a world that's full of challenge, right? We live in a world that is in desperate need of leaders, especially those who aspire to model their leadership after biblical truths and principles, to stand up, to help, to support, to guide, and to introduce Jesus to them. Introduce Jesus to this world. This morning we're going to talk about leadership, and we're going to do so for a very intentional reason. We study leadership because we believe, and I say we as those of us that teach leadership. That's what I do when I'm not working in the office there. I teach on leadership. We study because we believe it's mandatory to have leadership in order to move our churches, to move our families, to move our communities from where they are to where they need to be. Right? It takes leadership to do that. So let me begin this by telling you before I lose you here, that I wholeheartedly 100% believe that leadership is for everyone. Leadership is not just for the elders and the deacons and the ministers. It's not just for the CEOs and the business executives. It's not just for coaches and politicians and community organizers to talk about. It's not just for the most educated. Leadership is for the retired, it's for the youth group, it's for the college students in the audience, it's for the young professionals here. Leadership is for the single mom, and leadership is for the dad who's lost. Leadership is for everyone. I spent a great deal of my professional life studying this topic. I've studied it formally and informally. But beyond that, and much more than that, I have been blessed to have had many people in my life that have modeled and emulated leadership. Some of those folks were very visible people. Some of those folks, nobody would even know their name. That's where I've learned about leadership. And as I've studied and thought about leadership, I've become extremely certain that it is virtually impossible to study about leadership and separate it from the topic of personal growth. And more so, it's impossible to study leadership and to think about moving folks from where you are, from where they are, to where they need to be. It's impossible to separate that from spiritual growth. And I can't help but think how good timing is for a group of Christians to come together on a Sunday morning, a group of folks that I don't know very well, but I know that are focused on discipleship, that are focused on thinking about what's next and what God's calling this church to be, both in a preacher search and beyond. Every single one of us here today has a role to play in the future of this congregation, in the future of the souls that are outside of this congregation this morning, right? And it's going to take leadership to do that. And so this morning, I'm going to ask you to turn to the book of Esther. I'm going to ask you to turn to the book of Esther, and we're going to go through what is one of my favorite stories when I think about all of Scripture, really, but especially as I think about the topic of leadership. And so we're going to go to some specific passages, but I'm going to kind of summarize, for time's sake this morning, some of the key points along the way. So I would encourage you to think about Esther beyond what you remember maybe from the flannel graph version of Esther and the story. Let's go a little deeper into the text this morning and maybe pick out a few things that we've missed along the way. So let me start here. King Xerxes is a powerful and prosperous leader, ruler of Persia. His power on the earth is unmatched in the whole world at this time. In worldly terms, he has a whole lot to celebrate. He has a whole lot to celebrate, and he throws this massive party. And in the day and age that he's living in, this party is attended by just his friends, his male friends. And they have this moment, and they're drinking, and they're living it up for days and days and days during this party. And at one point, he calls for his wife, Queen Vashti, so he can put her on display. Okay? He can put her on display, and she does something that's unheard of. She refuses to come. She refuses to be there. She refuses to show up. And just like you can imagine if you've read Scripture or if you've read anything in history, kings don't like to be told no, do they? And so that is the end of Queen Vashti. He needs not only to be thought of in a way that his people will understand that if I summon, she will come, but he also now needs a new queen. As much as they don't like being told no, they don't like being queenless either. And so Xerxes orders a kingdom-wide, essentially a beauty pageant. Okay? And there's this young Jewish woman named Esther who had been orphaned as a child and raised by her relative Mordecai. And as Esther is brought before the king and those surrounding him, it is obvious immediately that she's the one for King Xerxes. He's so infatuated with her, in fact, that he doesn't even think to look into her background. It's all based on her outer beauty. Now, my wife is not with us this morning, but this is a similar thing that happened to me. I was a senior, she was a freshman. There she was. She was the most beautiful I'd ever seen. I didn't think that she might have student loans. I thought she was rich. She just had to be. I didn't think anything about her background, but that's a critical piece that we often forget. He didn't even look into her background. She's beautiful. She won everyone's heart, and he makes her the queen. This morning, we're going to think about three characters. These three characters are going to be the impetus for our conversation this morning. But I want us to think first, as we're introduced to a man named Haman. Haman has been recently appointed the second in command, which is a very powerful person. Haman suffers from this disease that I would call, and others have called, that I've heard others say, of kind of a leadership-itis. Okay? And what that really means is that leadership-itis is, and you can think about Haman, is that he has an ego that is out of control. You know, we all have an ego. God gave us an ego. But an ego out of control is a big problem. You might think back to Romans to think about how we ought to think of ourselves, not more highly, but think of ourselves with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has given to each of us. But Haman's not there. Haman's not there yet. When it's all said and done, while we all think we're the same, Haman thinks he is above everyone else. He has an ego that is extremely out of control. And guess what? Leadership-itis is contagious. Have you seen it? Have you seen it? Have you seen it? Have you worked with it? Have you lived with it? Have you seen it at church? Don't point fingers. Wait till you get home. Leadership-itis, an ego out of control. We have all seen it. We've all maybe even been there. People who have the disease tend to think their way of doing things is better than anyone else's, and their opinion is better and superior than anyone else's. And sometimes when you confront those that have an ego out of control, they tend to get defensive, vindictive. They might even go a little ballistic on you, right? It's not pretty. Leadership disease, ego out of control is very dangerous. Be very careful because it is easy to catch. In the book of Esther, chapter 3, verses 2 through 6, it says, "All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, 'Why do you disobey the king's command?' Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. For he had told them he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged." Ego out of control. "Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom under control and power of Xerxes." Haman has his ego way out of control. He loves to go about the city making sure that everyone knows he's a big deal. He wants everyone to see him. He wants everyone to not just see him, but to bow down before him. And it's in this passage we also come across another character by the name of Mordecai. This is the same Mordecai that the story of Esther tells us, who is not only Esther's relative who had taken care of her, but he's also at some point previously saved the life of King Xerxes. And Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman, and this infuriates Haman, and he decides that he's going to kill Mordecai. And in fact, Scripture tells us there in the book of Esther that he builds these gallows to hang Mordecai up to 75 feet tall. I don't know how tall 75 feet is, but it seems to be more than enough. It seems like it might be a bit showy, right? Haman's pretty excited. He wants people to know that he is worthy to be bowed down in front of. And if you don't, I'm going to show everyone what happens when you don't. 75 feet tall. It's all for show. It's all for ego. But that's not all. Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew. And he sees it as a grand opportunity, not just to make Mordecai an example, but to wipe out the Jewish people. And he deceives the king into issuing a decree to kill not only Mordecai, but also his people. Here's a side note for you. Proverbs says that pride comes before the fall. Remember that? Pride comes before the fall. And time again throughout history, we have seen people with an ego out of control who make a major mistake out of pride, and it costs them. Usually in a brutal and ugly way. And here's Haman's mistake. Enraged by his ego, he decides to promote the killing of all the Jews. Now remember Queen Esther. Remember our friend Esther? Remember how we didn't do the background check? The Jew, Esther. This isn't going to end well for the egomaniac Haman. So Mordecai sends a message to Esther and asks her to beg the king for mercy. And now, Queen Esther initially fears for her life because no one could do this. No one could legally go before the king without prior permission. It's also important to note right here and right now that Esther didn't aspire to this leadership position. She didn't work her way towards being the queen. She didn't ask for all this. She didn't ask to be put into this position. We don't know much about her leadership development program. We don't know which bestsellers she read. In fact, what we do know is that she was chosen for this position by the king mostly because of her outward beauty. She does have, obviously, skills and gifts because God wouldn't have put her, doesn't put anybody on this earth without skills and gifts and talents. But regardless of how she ended up in this leadership role, she winds up at the crossroads of her people's destiny and her own. She was put into an uncomfortable position where she had to make a decision. She could either risk her life by pleading her people's case before a dangerous king, or she could protect her people, or she could protect her position rather, and walk away from the crisis at hand. In the book of Esther, we find out exactly what she did. And Mordecai sends word to Esther and pleads with her using the famous words that many of you think about when you think about the word or the passage in Esther. When you think about the story in Esther, these famous words that football coaches all over the South and all over America will misquote in football games and pregame speeches in the coming months, right? That you have been here for such a time as this. You have been placed here for such a time as this. Well, let's think about it. Let's read through it, though. Esther 4:12. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent... let me back up to verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Then, and this is the piece that we often look over. This is the piece that I think is one of the most powerful in all of the Old Testament, if not all of Scripture. Esther sends this reply to Mordecai, Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And get this. And if I perish, I perish. And if I perish, I perish. Queen Esther was willing to put it all on the line. All of it. Her status, her position, her comfort, her stability, the perks of being a queen, even her very life in order to do what God had put her in this position to do. Providentially, yes, she was there for such a time as this, but Esther had the courage to say, I will do whatever it takes, and if I perish, I perish. Her courage wasn't a manifestation of reckless behavior. It wasn't because she had an ego out of control. It's because she believed that certain things were worth living for. And certain things were worth dying for. When I look at the state of the world and the state of even the church today, I can't help but think that for renewal to occur in our churches, and listen to me, for renewal to occur in all of our churches, in all of our families, in all of our communities, a whole generation of leaders is going to have to rise up with the courage of a teenage beauty queen. We're going to have to say enough is enough. There's a new reality out there. We're going to have to courageously examine what it means to be light in the darkness. We're going to have to understand what it means to be set apart in this day and age. We're going to have to understand that we have to be more biblical. We have to be more relevant. We have to be more intentional. We have to be more gracious, more loving, and we have to be Jesus to the world. And when we as leaders who are called to move towards the future with courage and boldness, we have to know that we may lose our status. We may take hits to our reputations. Our stability and our security may get rocked. We may be knocked clear out of our comfort zones, our personal preferences, and we may have to be willing to say, so be it. And we've got to do what God is calling us to do and has gifted us to do. And if we perish, we perish. There's something heartbreaking when we look around and think about all the leadership potential and its resulting impact for the kingdom that is lost because of the lack of courage, the lack of boldness, the lack of passion. And I'll tell you right now, I'm stepping all over my own toes. Stepping all over my own toes. I don't know how many times I've laid in bed or looked at myself in the mirror and said, all right, what are you waiting for? What are you going to do about it? What's the difference you're going to make? Just as in the Old Testament where we find a young beauty queen whose courage to do what God had called her to do, when is it that we are going to accept our called lead with courage? Maybe it's because I don't want to stretch myself. I don't want to study the Scriptures with a thirst for new and fresh perspectives. Maybe that might make me uncomfortable. I've gotten used to how I have compartmentalized my spiritual life in order to be nice, clean, comfortable. And maybe I found myself thinking that I don't have the time or the energy or the patience to put myself out there. Or maybe it's that we've grown complacent and apathetic with our walk with God. And when we feel this way, I pray that I and you here this morning will remember Esther, who when faced with a choice said, I'll do the right thing. I'll do the right thing, and if I perish, I perish. We need to pray that God will grant us with courage like Esther. So back to our story, Esther courageously risks it all and goes to the king, and he grants her anything that she wants. And she ends up throwing 2 different dinner parties for the king and invites his second in command, Haman. Haman, of course, is delighted to have been invited to such an important party for important people. This is what Haman does, right? So late after, somewhere at the end of the night on that first party, the king is doing some late night reading. And somewhere along the way, he had forgotten the story of how Mordecai had saved his life. It's interesting, it's in there. He's reminded that Mordecai has saved his life. And he wonders how he might honor such a great man. The king asks Haman to counsel him as to how we might honor one of his favorites. Assuming the king was talking about him, Haman dreams up this elaborate ceremony. It's not long after that Haman realizes, oh, this isn't about me. This isn't about me. And later at a second dinner party, Esther exposes Haman's plot to destroy her people. The king is furious at Haman. And let's just say there is a hanging on the 75-foot gallows. But it's not Mordecai. If there's one leadership principle that I try to keep tucked in the back of my head on a regular basis, it's this. Ego out of control always gets hung. I learned that years ago from a mentor of mine, and I'll never forget it. Ego out of control always gets hung. It may not be on a 75-foot gallows, but it may mean the loss of family. It may mean the loss of friendships. It may mean the loss of influence for the kingdom. It may mean a variety of different things, but ego out of control always gets hung. So Haman's gone, and Xerxes looks around and said, I need somebody else to be this number 2. And guess who he goes and finds? Mordecai. Mordecai. And this verse escaped me for a long, long time. It's the last verse in the book of Esther. Esther chapter 10, verse 3. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews. Because, listen to this is the key part. Because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Mordecai was held in high esteem. That's credibility, which is the basic fundamental of leadership. He's held in high esteem because he worked for the good of all the people and he spoke up for their welfare. He worked for the betterment of others. Complete opposite of Haman, right? Complete opposite. It wasn't about him or his ego. And that's the heart and that's the essence of leadership. We can talk a lot about leadership principles. We can talk a lot about character. We can talk about a lot of things that have to do with moving a group of folks from one spot to the next. But it boils down to this. It's working for the good and speaking up for the welfare of others you lead. So in my leadership classes with college students on campus, oftentimes I'll have them do an exercise, and it's an interesting exercise for 20-year-olds to do. I have them think about their 80th birthday party. I have them think about their 80th birthday party, and what I do there is I walk them through a series of thoughts to try to generate some thinking on their part to think about what life might look like, not at 80, but between where they are and 80. And I'll spare you all the details this morning. I've done the exercise many times myself. What I want students to think about, and what I think we need to think about, is when we come to the end, or we come near the end, or we come to a point down the road, whatever it may be, here's what I have my students think about. I want them to think about who is there. Who's at your 80th birthday party? Because if you're 80, it's probably not your parents. It may not be your aunts and uncles. It's going to look a whole lot different than it does right now. Who's going to be there? And the other part is, what stories are they telling about you? I hope it's not just about how you were great and you took everybody on vacations. I hope that's peace, maybe. But what I hope is that when you think about life at 80, or when you think about life somewhere in the future, and you think about who's there at my birthday party and what stories are they telling me, I'll tell you what I really hope, that my kids, who I hope are at my 80th birthday party. Not because they have to be, but because they want to be. And these grandkids that I can't imagine. My son turned 6 today, so I'm a long ways from grandkids. But I think about it, and I have a really clear picture in my head that when I turn 80, I want my grandkids to be there because they want to be, not because they have to be. And here's what I want them to think about. I hope my children and grandchildren are there, and I want them to tell stories about these kinds of things. I want them to tell stories about how I lived a life that wasn't focused on myself or my ego. I want them to tell stories about how I worked for the good and spoke up for the welfare of them and others. And Lord, I hope and pray that they will tell stories of how I had the courage to stand up and do what God had called me to do for His glory, for His kingdom, His church, no matter the cost. Those are the stories I want them to tell about me, and I've got a lot of work to do between now and then. Lord willing, I'll have the time to do that. That's what leaders do. That's what fathers and mothers and sons and daughters and elders and deacons and Bible class teachers and youth group members, that's what we're called to do as we lead. To make a difference, to have the courage to make the difference that we're called to no matter the cost. Fast forward a few hundred years from where we are in Esther, and we find the greatest example of leadership there ever was. Jesus Christ, the greatest leader to ever walk. Jesus Christ, the greatest leader to ever walk on the earth, and with every selfless action, with every selfless word, Jesus worked and spoke up courageously for our good and for our welfare. And His courage didn't end there. He was courageous even to the point of death on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins. It was never about His own ego or self-interest. His life was completely devoted to the spiritual betterment of His people, and He was courageous. As we close here, I want everybody to take your hand and do this right here. Everybody take your fingers and do this. Then I want you to put it on your chin. 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 Some of you are still right here. Greatest leadership lesson I ever learned probably was that it's much more about what you do than what you say. If we want to be a church about discipleship, if we want to be a church that makes a difference in this community and beyond, if we want to be a church that says we will not cave to the world, it's going to be a whole lot more about what we do than what we say. It's going to be a whole lot more about what we do than what we say. So let's consider this real quick. What is it that God's calling this church to be a part of? I don't know the answer to that. I just met you. But I suspect God's doing some things here on some of your hearts that could be what's next for this church. Where is it in our life that we're being called to lead? Every one of you has a place to lead. You may say, I'm not the one out front. It doesn't matter. Some of the greatest leaders in all of Christendom, if all the history of the Bible were not the ones who were out front, they were the ones behind. If you have a family you can lead yourself first. Where is it that you're being called to lead? Are we willing to lead courageously because we believe that the good news of Jesus Christ is worth dying for? That's the real question. If we want to be a church about discipleship, if we want to be about bringing others to Christ, that's the decision point we have to have, because it's going to get uncomfortable. It's going to take us out of our comfort zones, right? And maybe, just maybe, like Esther, we need to summon all the courage we can in order to do and to go where God is calling us.